Should those protesters, David Lammy, should they be protesting in large numbers during this pandemic, given that the law currently says you shouldn't meet up with any more than 6 people from other households?
Well, I said, look, protest, but protest socially distanced with your sanitizer, wearing a mask. And I recognise that those people who are going out protesting are making a judgment that the issue that they are protesting about matters more to them than the issues that arise with social distancing. And I think the reason for that is, certainly for those who are black on those protests, this is costing lives and this is costing livelihoods. Yeah. And we know that actually even during this coronavirus crisis, you're 54% more likely to get a fine if you are black.
You know, David, my middle boy...
so ironic,
my middle boy, who's
so
an actor, he went twice on these protests in London, on Friday and yesterday. And he got a bit of stick for it on Twitter. I got a lot of stick for it. You know, I'm a hypocrite. He's an adult. He's 22. He can do what he likes. It's his life. And I had a long chat with him yesterday when he was driving back from the protest. I said, right, let's go through this. I said, why is it legitimate to have a mass protest in the middle of a pandemic when it's against the rules? First of all, he said, well, when it comes to rule breaking, none of my age group will take any lectures from this government, given what happened with Dominic Cummings. That was his first thought. His second thought was, he said, more importantly, to me, racism is a virus. It's a disease. It's killing a lot of people. And he said, much as I would like to have gone and protested about this when it was safer to do so, George Floyd didn't choose the moment to be murdered on camera for nearly 9 minutes. And he was very powerful and eloquent. Now, I said to him, look, you've got to be as safe as you can if you're going to do this. Said that to him before he went yesterday, and he was masked up, he wore gloves. He said that a lot of the protesters were holding their hands out to keep a distance. But there's no doubt, David Lammy, is there, that there's a conflict here between people who perhaps have had loved ones with their dying and not being able to go and see them. Funerals where only a handful of people have been there. And yet the people who have had to go through that and make that sacrifice now turn on their television and they see 50, 60,000 people all massed together and no one doing anything to stop it. And they're like, well, why have I had to go through all this self-sacrifice? What do you say to them?
Well, this broke down, didn't it, some weeks ago when the Prime Minister's senior advisor went out on his wife's birthday because he was testing his eyesight. But what I'd say is this, is that at this time, across black, Asian and minority ethnic families, it's very hard not to know someone who's been affected or died as a result of coronavirus. I've lost a classmate. I've lost an uncle. In my mosque, one mosque I've lost 20, in another I've lost 6. I've lost my chief rabbi here in the community in Tottenham. So for all of those reasons, people see what is happening and actually, in some senses, they protest that as well. And so there's a calculation that people make, aware of the risk, particularly if they cause criminal damage, that the issues of racial justice are more important or as important, and they want to raise their voice.
OK, Alex, I think that's the argument I'm certainly hearing loud and clear. Let's bring in Mayor Marvin Rees, who's Mayor of Bristol. Mr Mayor, it's a fine line, isn't it? I watched one of the police chiefs in Bristol talking about why they didn't intervene. And I thought that was the right thing to do. I then saw Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, calling it appalling. What is your view?
I think our police handled it incredibly well in Bristol. We didn't have the violent confrontations they had elsewhere. And that just goes to speak to the importance of recognising and respecting local leadership rather than trying to do command and control from Whitehall and Westminster. We know our local population. They know what was going on the ground, and they judge the situation well.
When I see in Westminster, for example, a protester picking up a bicycle and throwing it at mounted police officers, and when I see a group of people cheering when a female police officer, her horse bolted in the protesting that was going on and hit a traffic lamp and nearly, I mean, it was a very serious incident, hit it at high speed and suffered quite serious injuries. When I see that kind of behaviour by the protesters, I think that is completely wrong. What is your view?
Yeah, well, I'm just pleased we didn't have that in Bristol, and in many ways that is the result of fantastic, policing down here. But the reason local leadership is so important is because they knew the context. Our Chief Constable, our Bristol Commander, was very aware of the context within which this event was taking place, the meaning, the frustrations of the local population, and actually not just in terms of criminal justice, but the wider frustrations there has been around austerity, the loss of services, a sense of identity within Bristol. So for example, I as a local leader, I don't condone criminal damage, and I've raised repeatedly concerns about mass gatherings in the middle of a pandemic. So I didn't attend myself. But what I cannot do, same as Alex there, my dad is Jamaican. I cannot pretend that statue was anything other than an affront to me.
Marvin Rees, what do we do then about, you're the mayor of the city, a city which has benefited from a horrific trade in slaves. And as Alex was saying, White Ladies Road, Black Boy Hill, all of the monuments, all of the buildings named after Edward Colston, the slave trader. What does Bristol do? Does it continue to acknowledge and reflect that history, but in some way atone for it? Or does it start to rip down all the monuments to that slave trading legacy?
No, well, look, we have to be kind of careful here. You don't solve the legacy of slavery and racism by taking down monuments and symbolic acts. They can be important, of course they are, to the extent to which they tell us who we are. But you've got to begin to get into questions of social immobility, the way in which the independent schools and Oxbridge have a stranglehold on positions of power in this country, and certain people from certain backgrounds do not get access to those institutions, inequalities in the criminal justice system. The symbolic act of tearing down statues and monuments in and of themselves do not solve those challenges. What they can do is heighten our awareness and take us another step towards our ability to confront those wider challenges that we have to take on. Okay. So I do have some concerns. I think this is iconic. But my concern is that we shouldn't expect racism to disappear tomorrow, next week, next month, or even in 2 years' time. This is one event in a long line of events in which people have raised their voice about their frustrations with race inequality. But I would also say some of the wider frustrations of class inequality and injustice and unfairness in our country and in our world. OK,
let's bring in True Powell. True, you took your two daughters, 13 and 17, to the Birmingham Black Lives Matter rally. Your cousin was Mikey Powell, who died of asphyxiation in 2003 while being arrested. So I guess my first question for you is, it must have brought back for you and your family appalling memories when you saw what was happening to George Floyd.
Absolutely, Piers. When we seen what happened to George Floyd, it just allowed all these emotions to resurface. It's a really emotional time for us right now, as you could imagine. When police was called to the house of Mikey, he was immediately hit by a police car. He was then beaten with a baton. He was then CS gassed. He was then restrained by multiple officers. He was then thrown in the back of a police van. And it was in that van that Mikey took his last breath. It was in that van that it was declared that Mikey died from positional asphyxiation, in the same way or in the same position that George Floyd died. And actually, we don't know whether Mikey said in that van to those officers, similar to George Floyd, "I can't breathe, please let me breathe." Then Mikey was then taken into the police cell face down and then thrown into a cell. And to me, that was because of Mikey's race. The police immediately made assumptions as to who Mikey was when they seen him because of his race and the location where he was. And personally, the reason why I took my girls to the protest, to the peaceful protest, was because I wanted them to be a part of this change. I wanted their voices to be heard. I wanted them to understand the plight that Black people are facing at the moment. And I wanted them to be a part of that movement. It's all good and well that the world is coming together, but our children need to understand systematic racism, and our children need to be a part of dismantling that. as well as everybody else, so as well as white people, as well as you, Susanna, you, Piers, and everybody else that's on this panel. We all need to do our bit in order to break down and dismantle racism.
It's absolutely horrific listening to you describe what happened to your cousin. And one of the tragic things about it was that the police were called by his own mother, who expected police to help because he was suffering, wasn't he, a mental health episode. Yes. She simply needed help because she couldn't intervene. And you believe that this wouldn't have happened if he had been a white man.
If Mikey was a white man and the police had been called to a house in Sutton or Solihull, which is a couple of the more affluent areas within Birmingham, that I can assure you would not have happened. The police would have found out what was going on, found out about the altercation and found ways to diffuse it, but they made assumptions on Mikey because of his race.
Okay, and let's bring in Leroy Logan. Look, Leroy, you've been on the police side of this. I mean, it has to be said, there is a qualitative difference, notwithstanding the appalling thing that happened that we've just heard. These are still rarities, thankfully, in this country. In America, the issue of police brutality against Black Americans has a long and extremely disturbing history. What is the answer here? You're seeing in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed, the city overnight, the city council is moving to defund the police force. I mean, these are extraordinary times.
Well, I think there's a good case to really look at how police assets are used, like responding to cases where a person needs support and to be treated as a patient, such as a mental health case, and them, assisting young people in a way that is not just about enforcement. I think the whole issue of George Floyd and other deaths and police contact over the years has laid bare the systemic failures in policing and other services, which needs to be addressed. And I would say 20 years ago, the McPherson recommendations brought in clearly the cultural change that we needed. And there was a certain amount of that. And unfortunately, they got rid of the independent oversight of those recommendations in the Stephen Lawrence steering group. And that's when things started to go down, and then you laid on austerity. There was a review by the Home Affairs Select Committee by Yvette Cooper last year around the 20 years of the McPherson recommendations. And we haven't heard from that review. That, I think, would give a litmus test of how far things have gone back. I think we're in a pre-Lawrence era because of what's happened in terms of the lack of grip and leadership in the police and in the mayor office in London, and also the Home Secretary. And I would like to think that Boris Johnson, with his track record in racist taunts, etc., can get a grip of this